September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay, USS Missouri. The Japanese delegation steps onto American steel. The war is already lost. The cities have burned. The fleets have been broken. The skies have belonged to the enemy. The empire that once pushed across Asia and the Pacific now walks slowly across the deck of an American battleship, not to negotiate victory, not to threaten, not to command, to surrender. Every movement is watched. Every face is measured. Every uniform carries the weight of defeat. Japanese officials stand before the nations that have forced the war to its end. The deck is crowded, but the silence feels larger than the ship itself. Sailors, officers, cameras, Allied representatives, the eyes of the world. At the center of the ceremony stands General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander, the man history remembers most clearly from this moment. But he is not alone on that deck. Around him stand representatives from the Allied nations, the United States, China, Britain, the Soviet Union, Australia, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Canada. For the Japanese delegation, this is not only an American moment. It may look like MacArthur's stage. It may feel like American power, an American battleship, an American general, an American victory camera pointed at the defeated. But the document on the table belongs to the Allied world. Japan is not surrendering to one man. It is surrendering to a coalition. To the nations it fought. To the nations whose soldiers, sailors, airmen, prisoners, and civilians have carried the war to this morning. The war is over, in fact. Now it must end in ink. That is what makes the moment so heavy. A signature is small, a line of ink, a hand moving across paper. But on this deck, every signature carries ships sunk, cities bombed, prisoners taken, families broken, and years of sacrifice. A name on the page is not just a name. It is a nation standing in history. And among those waiting to sign is a Canadian, Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave. He is not the most famous man on the deck. He is not the commander of the occupation. He is not the face on the posters, but he stands there for Canada, for a country that had entered the war years earlier, for a country whose sailors crossed the Atlantic in dangerous waters, for a country whose airfields trained Allied aircrew, for a country whose soldiers fought in Europe, for a country that had suffered its own direct wound against Japan at Hong Kong. To the Japanese delegation, he may be one more Allied representative, another uniform, another signature, another nation lined up behind the power that has ended the war. But to Canada, his presence means something deeper. Canada is not watching from the side. Canada is not absent from the final ceremony. Canada has a place on the deck, a place on the document, a place in the ending. That is the story many people miss. Everyone remembers MacArthur. Everyone remembers the battleship. Everyone remembers Japan surrendering. But among the Allied officers standing there, representing the nations that fought to bring the war to its close, was a Canadian. And before the morning is over, his signature will become part of one of the strangest human moments in the entire surrender ceremony. But Canada's signature on that deck was not decoration. It had been paid for long before Tokyo Bay. Before Canada stood on the deck of USS Missouri, Canada had stood in the war for almost 6 years. Not as a spectator, not as a country waiting for others to decide the outcome, but as an allied nation, committed from the beginning of the struggle against Hitler's Germany and later against Imperial Japan. Canada's Second World War was not one battlefield. It was many. The Atlantic, the skies over Europe, the training fields at home, the factories, the convoys, the infantry campaigns, the prisoner camps, the families waiting for letters that sometimes never came. For Japan's delegation on that deck, Canada may not have looked like the largest power present. It was not. The United States dominated the Pacific War by 1945, with ships, aircraft, submarines, industry, island campaigns, and finally weapons the world had never seen before. China had endured years of brutal war. Britain and the Commonwealth had fought across Asia. Australia had fought close to home. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan in its final days, with devastating force. Canada was smaller, But smaller does not mean absent. Suddenly Canada's war effort had weight. Canadian sailors fought to keep the Atlantic routes alive. Convoys crossed cold, dangerous water, while German submarines hunted beneath the surface. Those convoys fed Britain, supplied armies, carried weapons, moved men and material through a war where logistics could decide survival. Canadian airfields became part of the Allied machine. Through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, aircrew from Canada and other Allied countries trained across Canadian skies before joining the war. Pilots, navigators, wireless operators, bomb aimers, gunners, men learning in Canada before flying into danger somewhere else. Canadian soldiers fought in Europe. They landed in Sicily, advanced through Italy, stormed Juno Beach in Normandy, fought through the Scheldt, helped liberate the Netherlands. They were not invincible. They were not untouched by fear. They bled. They failed sometimes. They adapted. They endured. And they kept going until the war in Europe ended. But the war against Japan also touched Canada directly. That connection is important, because Canada's signature on Japan's surrender was not only diplomatic formality. It carried memory. It carried Hong Kong. It carried prisoners. It carried families who had learned that the Pacific War was not distant. It was real. It had Canadian names in it. This is why Cosgrave's presence matters. He was not simply filling a line on a document. He was representing a country that had contributed to the Allied war across oceans and years. A country that had paid in ships, aircraft, prisoners, training, soldiers, and dead. A country that had earned the right to stand at the end. The Japanese delegation stood before MacArthur, but behind MacArthur stood more than American power. The deck itself told the story. Nation after nation. Uniform after uniform. Signature after signature. The war had not been fought by one country alone, and the surrender would not be signed by one country alone. Canada was there because Canada had fought. Canada was there because Canada had suffered. Canada was there because the end of the Second World War belonged to all the nations that had carried the burden. To understand the Canadian signature, you have to go back to Canada's darkest Pacific wound. From the Japanese side, the deck of USS Missouri could have felt like an American stage. The ship was American. The cameras were focused on MacArthur. The harbor was filled with Allied power, but American power dominated the scene. For years, the United States had pushed Japan back across the Pacific. Island by island, sea lane by sea lane, airfield by airfield. The Japanese Navy had been broken. Japanese cities had been bombed. The home islands had been blockaded. And in August 1945, the war had reached a level of destruction no country had ever faced before. Japan feared the United States for obvious reasons. Naval power, air power, industry, submarines, aircraft carriers, bombing, blockade, the ability to keep coming with more ships, more aircraft, more fuel, more men, and more weapons. To Japanese commanders, American power was not only what it had already destroyed, it was what it could still do if the war continued. But Japan did not face only America. China had endured Japanese aggression for years before the wider Pacific War became a global conflict. Chinese soldiers and civilians had paid a terrible price. That war had drained Japan long before the surrender deck. Britain and Commonwealth forces had fought across Asia and the Pacific. Australia had fought in a war that felt close to its own shores. The Netherlands had lost its East Indies. France had its own colonial wounds in Asia. And in August 1945, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, attacking in Manchuria and destroying Japan's hope that Moscow might serve as a diplomatic bridge. So when the Japanese delegation looked across the deck, they were not looking at one enemy. They were looking at the Allied world, the nations that had surrounded Japan militarily, the nations that had endured occupation, bombing, defeat, captivity, hunger, and years of war, the nations that now stood in line to make Japan's surrender official. Canada was part of that line. Not the largest, not the loudest, not the country most people think of first when they imagine the Pacific War, but present. And presence matters in history. Because ceremonies are not only about who speaks the most, they are about who has earned the right to stand there when the final page is signed. For Japan's representatives, Canada was one of the Allied nations adding its name to defeat. For Canada, that moment held a different meaning. Canada had fought Germany from 1939. Canada had suffered in Hong Kong after Japan entered the war. Canada had contributed sailors, airmen, soldiers, training, industry, and diplomacy to the Allied victory. Canada had not carried the Pacific War like the United States. It had not endured invasion like China. It had not fought close to home like Australia. But Canada had still paid. And that payment gave weight to the signature. This is the difference between scale and meaning. Canada's Pacific role was smaller than America's. That must be said honestly. But it was not meaningless. It was not absent. It was not invisible to the families who lost men. It was not invisible to the prisoners who endured Japanese captivity. It was not invisible to the country represented by Cosgrave on the deck. The Japanese delegation may have come to surrender under MacArthur's command. But the page they signed did not belong only to MacArthur. It belonged to the coalition. And on that page, among the names of the Allied nations, was Canada. But for Canada, the war against Japan had one memory that still hurt. Hong Kong, December 1941. Hong Kong. For Canada, the war against Japan was not only a headline from across the ocean. It was not only maps of islands, fleets, and distant capitals. It was not only something happening to other armies. It had Canadian names, Canadian uniforms, Canadian families waiting for news, Canadian soldiers standing in a place far from home when Japan attacked. The Japanese assault came fast. It came with pressure. It came with momentum. To the Japanese command, Hong Kong was an isolated Allied position that could be struck, overwhelmed, and taken. The defenders were outnumbered, cut off, and facing an enemy that had prepared for a wider war across Asia and the Pacific. From the Japanese point of view, the expectation was clear. Hit hard, move fast, break the defenses, force surrender. Among the defenders were Canadians, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Royal Rifles of Canada, men who had crossed the Pacific not knowing they were about to become part of one of Canada's darkest early chapters of the war against Japan. They fought alongside British, Indian, local, and other Allied defenders. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting because the war had reached them, and because the position had to be held as long as it could be held. The defense of Hong Kong was brutal and short. The Japanese attack pushed hard. The defenders were forced back. Positions fell. Communications strained. A city and its garrison were caught inside an enemy offensive that moved faster than hope. The Canadians should not be portrayed as invincible. They were not. They were soldiers in a desperate fight against overwhelming conditions. They suffered. They resisted. They lost. And when Hong Kong surrendered, many Canadians became prisoners of war. This is where the story becomes heavier, because defeat was not the end of suffering. For many prisoners, captivity under Japan became its own war, a war of hunger, disease, forced labor, brutality, fear, waiting, survival. Exact numbers, camp details, and casualty figures must be verified carefully before final production, because these are not details to use loosely. But the broad truth is clear. Canadian prisoners taken by Japan suffered deeply, and families in Canada carried that suffering without being able to rescue them. This is why Canada's presence on the USS Missouri matters. It was not just diplomatic courtesy. It was not a small country being given a polite place at a large ceremony. Canada had a wound in the Pacific. When Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave stood on that deck in 1945, he represented a country that had paid in the war against Japan too. Not on the same scale as the United States, not with the same Pacific footprint as Australia or China, but with real blood, real prisoners, real families, real memory. For the Japanese delegation in Tokyo Bay, Canada may have looked like one more Allied signatory. But behind that signature stood the men of Hong Kong, the men who did not come home, the men who came home changed, the families who waited. The country that had learned, in December 1941, that the Pacific War was not distant. It could reach Canada, and Canada would remember. The Canadian signature at Japan's surrender did not erase Hong Kong. Nothing could. But it placed Canada at the final table when the war that had taken those men into captivity officially ended. And the man chosen to sign for Canada carried scars of his own from an earlier war. Before Lawrence Moore Cosgrave stood on the deck of the USS Missouri, he had already lived through another world war. He was not a young man stepping into history for the first time. He was a Canadian soldier, veteran, and diplomat whose life had already been marked by conflict. The Second World War was ending in front of him, but the First World War had already left its wound on him. Cosgrave had served in the First World War. He had been wounded. He lost sight in one eye from that earlier injury. That detail matters, but it must be handled with respect, not as comedy. Not as an excuse to laugh at a mistake, not as a weakness, as a human fact, a scar carried from one war into the final ceremony of another. By 1945, Cosgrave was no longer just a soldier in the field. He had served in diplomatic and military roles. He was Canada's representative at one of the most important formal ceremonies in modern history, the surrender of Japan, the formal closing of the Second World War's final chapter. On that deck, he stood among giants of the moment: MacArthur, Allied commanders, Japanese signatories, representatives of nations whose armies, navies, air forces, and civilians had carried the war. The cameras were not there for Cosgrave. History's spotlight was not centered on him. But sometimes history is not only made by the person at the microphone. Sometimes history is made by the person who steps forward, signs a line, and reminds the world that his country was there. To the Japanese delegation, Cosgrave was part of the Allied order surrounding them. Another officer, another nation, another signature that would make Japan's surrender final. But to Canadians, he represented something larger. The country's service, its losses, its war effort, its prisoners, its sacrifices in Europe, the Atlantic, the air, and the Pacific. The symbol is the signature, a pen in a Canadian hand. A name on a surrender document. A line that says Canada was not absent. Canada was not merely watching the world's largest powers close the war. Canada had earned a place at the table. That is the proud core of the story. And yet, this was still a human moment. A formal ceremony can be planned. A stage can be arranged. A document can be printed with perfect lines. Officers can stand in perfect order. Cameras can be positioned. The world can watch. But when the pen reaches the paper, history still passes through a human hand. Cosgrave had come to sign for Canada. One signature, one line, one formal act in the closing of the war. But on one copy of that document, the line he signed would become one of the strangest moments of the surrender ceremony. September 2nd, 1945, USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. The ceremony was designed to leave no doubt. Japan had surrendered. The Allies had won. The war that had consumed the world was ending under the eyes of cameras, sailors, officers, and representatives from the nations that had fought it. Every detail carried weight. The ship, the table, the documents, the order of signing, the uniforms, the silence. This was MacArthur's stage. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the center as Supreme Allied Commander. He understood symbolism. He understood theater. He understood that surrender ceremonies do more than record defeat. They teach the world how defeat will be remembered. The Japanese delegation would sign under Allied authority. The Allied representatives would sign as witnesses and victors. The war would pass from violence into document, from gunfire into ink. From the Japanese side, the ceremony had to be precise. They had lost the war. But the surrender still had to be formal, legal, valid, recognizable. A defeated nation could no longer dictate terms, but it could still notice procedure. It could still study the paper. It could still care that the lines were correct, that the names were clear, that the instrument of surrender was not confused. That is the tension hidden inside a ceremony. No bullets are flying. No ships are firing. No aircraft are attacking. But the stakes are still enormous. The surrender document is not a souvenir. It is the formal instrument that closes Japan's war. Every signature matters. Every line matters. Every printed country title matters. The document must survive scrutiny from both sides. MacArthur's stage is calm, but the calm is controlled. Officers stand in place. The Japanese delegation waits. Allied representatives prepare to sign. The cameras record the moment for history. The deck of the Missouri becomes more than steel. It becomes the final courtroom of the Pacific War. Japan stands before the Allied world. The Japanese military had once expected victory through expansion, speed, and force. Now it faced a different kind of power. Not a carrier strike, not a bombardment, not an invasion beach. A document. A ceremony. A coalition standing in silence. This was defeat made official. The ceremony was brief but heavy. A few minutes. A few signatures. A few names added in order. And yet those minutes carried years of fighting behind them. Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Manchuria. All of it had led to this deck. The Japanese representatives had already come to accept surrender. The Allied nations had come to witness it. The stage had been built to show perfect Allied control. Then Canada stepped forward to sign. September 2nd, 1945, USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. Before the Allied nations signed, Japan had to step forward. The defeated had to sign first. That was the order of the moment. That was the meaning of the ceremony. The empire that had fought across Asia and the Pacific now had to place its name on the document that ended its war. From the Japanese side, every step toward the table carried weight. The deck was not neutral ground. It was American steel, a battleship, a symbol of the naval power Japan had tried to defeat and could not. Around the Japanese delegation stood Allied officers from nations that had fought Japan for years. There was no escape from the symbolism. The empire had come aboard the victor's ship, not to bargain, not to threaten, not to command, to surrender. Mamoru Shigemitsu stepped forward for the Japanese government. He represented the emperor and the civilian authority of Japan in this formal act of surrender. His movement was slow, formal, watched by every camera and every officer on the deck. The world would see this. Japan would see this. The Allied nations would see this. A signature, once written, could not be unwritten. Then came General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Japanese military. That mattered, because this was not only a government surrender. It was the surrender of an armed system, an army, a navy, a military command that had carried Japan into war across the Pacific and Asia. Now that military authority also had to sign. For years, Japanese military power had expected obedience from conquered cities, occupied territories, prisoners, and civilians under its control. But on this deck, Japanese military authority had no battlefield left to command, no fleet that could reverse the war, no island line that could restore the empire, no diplomatic escape that could erase defeat. The war was no longer theirs to continue. This is the enemy's deepest realization, not fear in a foxhole, not panic under artillery, not shock at a battlefield collapse. Something colder, a public acceptance that the future no longer belongs to the side that once believed it could take it by force. The Japanese representatives signed in front of the Allied world, in front of cameras, in front of sailors, in front of the nations that had survived, resisted, and fought back. There was no cheering in this moment, not in the way people imagine victory. The mood was formal, heavy, controlled, because the war had cost too much to turn the final act into a simple celebration. Behind the signatures were millions of dead, cities destroyed, prisoners who had suffered, families who would never be repaired, civilian wounds across Asia and the Pacific that would outlast the ceremony. Then MacArthur signed as Supreme Allied Commander. The Allied process began. One by one, the representatives of the victorious nations would add their names. Each signature would make the surrender more complete. Each country would stand in history. Each line would represent a different path through the war. For Japan, this was another form of defeat. Not only signing the document, watching others sign it after them, watching the coalition add its authority. watching country after country formalize the end of Japanese power. The ceremony was not only a surrender, it was a line of witnesses, and Canada's turn was coming. The Allied representatives began to sign, one by one, nation by nation, line by line. Each man stepped forward carrying more than his own name. He carried the war of his country. He carried the dead, the prisoners, the ships, the airfields, the factories, the families, the years. To the Japanese delegation, this was the formal weight of defeat. The United States had already dominated the stage, but now the other Allied nations added themselves to the page. China, Britain, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand. Names printed on paper. Countries made visible in ink. Canada's line was there, not as decoration, not as a courtesy without meaning, as recognition. A country that had fought from 1939 to 1945 now had a place on the document ending Japan's war. Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave stepped forward to sign for Canada. He was not the loudest figure on the deck. He was not the most photographed. He was not the man history would place at the center of the ceremony. But the line he approached mattered. The Dominion of Canada had a place among the Allied signatories. A Canadian hand would add Canada's name to the end of the war. This is the proud center of the story. Canada was there. Not in the background of history. Not only in Europe. Not only at Juno Beach. Not only in Italy. Not only in the Atlantic. Canada was there at the formal surrender of Japan. On the deck of USS Missouri, beside the Allied nations, beside MacArthur's stage, at the closing ceremony of the Second World War's final chapter. That signature carried more than a name. It carried Hong Kong. Canadian soldiers who had fought and suffered, prisoners who had endured captivity, sailors who had crossed the Atlantic, aircrew trained in Canadian skies, factories that worked through wartime years, families who waited, communities that sent men and women into service, a country that was smaller than the great powers, but not absent from the great struggle. To the Japanese delegation, Cosgrave may have been one Allied officer among many. But that is how coalition war works. History often remembers the biggest voice, the loudest commander, the most powerful fleet, the nation at the center of the camera. But victory is built by more than the center. It is built by every line of effort that holds long enough to matter. Canada's role in the Pacific was not the same as America's. It should not be exaggerated. Canada did not carry the main Pacific campaign. Canada did not command the surrender ceremony. Canada did not stand at the center of Allied Pacific power. But Canada had fought. Canada had suffered. Canada had contributed. And on September 2nd, 1945, Canada was recognized. That recognition is the story. A Canadian officer, standing among the Allied representatives, signing for a country whose war had reached from the Atlantic to Europe to Hong Kong and finally to Tokyo Bay. One signature. One line. One moment. Canada was there. But history does not pass through perfect machines. It passes through human hands. And on the Japanese copy of the surrender document, one human mistake was about to interrupt the perfect ceremony. The surrender ceremony had been built for precision. Every officer in place. Every nation in order. Every signature line printed. Every camera ready. Every movement part of a ritual meant to show that the war had ended under control. Then the line went wrong. Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave signed the Japanese copy of the instrument of surrender, one line too low. This detail must be stated carefully. The mistake happened on the Japanese copy, not the Allied copy. Cosgrave had lost sight in one eye from a First World War injury, and many accounts connect that injury to the signing error. But the point is not to mock him. The point is that even at the most formal ceremony in the world, history still depended on a human hand finding the correct line. One line too low. A small movement. A small displacement. But on a legal document, small things matter. The signatures that followed were pushed onto the wrong lines. France. The Netherlands. New Zealand. The order of the document became confused. The page that was supposed to show perfect Allied authority now looked irregular. Not meaningless, not destroyed, but wrong enough to matter. From the Japanese delegation's point of view, this was not a joke. They had lost the war. They had stepped onto the deck of an enemy battleship. They had signed surrender. But the document still had to be valid, formal, precise. A surrender document is not a casual paper. It is the instrument that closes war. And the Japanese side noticed the error. This is where the story becomes tense in a different way. No one fires a shot. No one draws a weapon. No one threatens a counterattack. But for a few moments, the ceremony built to close the deadliest war in human history has a problem. The war is over, in fact. The signatures are being written. But the paper meant to prove the ending is now messy. That is a different kind of battlefield. Not mud, not jungle, not ocean. Procedure, law, protocol, the final terrain of surrender. And even there, mistakes can matter. Because a defeated power still watches the terms. A defeated delegation still studies the document. A defeated state still cares how its surrender is written. For Cosgrave, the mistake became the part of the story people remembered. But it should not erase the meaning of his presence. He was there because Canada had a place at the table. He signed because Canada had earned that line. The error made the moment human. It did not make the Canadian presence meaningless. It did not make Canada absent. It did not undo the sacrifice behind the signature. Still, the problem had to be fixed. The Japanese copy could not simply remain confused. The ceremony could not end with uncertainty over the document's lines. Someone had to correct the paper that ended the war. For a few minutes, the war was over. But the paper ending it had to be fixed. September 2nd, 1945, USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. The mistake was on the page. Not hidden, not theoretical, visible. A signature in the wrong place. A line shifted. Names no longer matching the printed countries beneath them. For a surrender ceremony built on order, the document now carried disorder in ink. From the Japanese side, this mattered. They had come to surrender. They had signed. They had accepted defeat before the Allied world. But surrender still had to be formal. It had to be clear. It had to be legally recognizable. A defeated delegation could not reverse the war, but it could still look at the document and see that something was wrong. This is where the story could easily be told as embarrassment. It should not be. Because the deeper truth is not that a Canadian made a mistake. The deeper truth is that even in the most controlled moment of the war, history remained human. Pens slip. Eyes misread lines. Pressure sits on shoulders. The deck is crowded. The world is watching. And one small error can suddenly force powerful men to fix the paper that is supposed to close a world war. General Richard Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, stepped in. The exact sequence and wording should be checked carefully before final production, but the commonly told account is clear in its broad shape. The printed country names on the Japanese copy had to be corrected. Sutherland crossed out the mistaken printed titles. He wrote the correct country names by hand. He initialed the changes. The document that had become irregular was made acceptable. This was not dramatic in the usual military sense. No artillery. No charge. No final duel. Only an officer leaning over a document with a pen. But that pen mattered, because the war was already over in power. Now it had to be over in procedure. The correction turned confusion back into order. It took a flawed page and made it a valid instrument of surrender. From the Japanese delegation's point of view, this was the final limit of their power. They could notice the problem. They could object to confusion. They could require clarity. But they could not change the result. The Allied staff corrected the paper. The surrender stood. The Empire had no road back through a clerical error. That is why the moment is powerful. Not because it makes Canada look foolish. Not because it turns the surrender into a joke. But because it reveals the strange fragility of formal history. The ending of the deadliest war in human history depended, in that moment, on ink, lines, handwriting, and initials. The same war that had filled oceans with ships and skies with aircraft now came down to whether the country names on a page could be corrected by hand. And Canada's role remained. Cosgrave's signature remained. The Canadian presence remained. The mistake did not remove Canada from the ceremony. It did not erase Hong Kong. It did not erase the Atlantic. It did not erase the airfields, the sailors, the prisoners, the families, or the years of service. It became a human story inside a proud national moment. MacArthur's stage had survived the human error. The Japanese copy had been corrected. The Allied signatures still stood. The surrender still closed the war. But the mistake became famous because people remember imperfections. They remember the unexpected. They remember the moment when the perfect ceremony briefly became human. The mistake became famous. But it was never the real story. The real story was what Canada's signature meant. A signature can look small. A name, a line, a few movements of the hand, ink drying on paper. But on the deck of USS Missouri, Canada's signature carried more than the hand that wrote it. It carried a country. It carried the sailors of the Royal Canadian Navy, who crossed the Atlantic again and again, while German U-boats hunted beneath the waves. It carried convoy routes through freezing water, black nights, signal lamps, depth charges, ships that arrived, ships that did not. It carried the airfields of Canada. The training bases where young men learned to fly, navigate, signal, aim, and survive before being sent into a war that did not care how young they were. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan made Canadian skies part of the Allied war machine. Not glamorous, not always remembered, but essential. It carried the soldiers who fought in Europe, Italy, Normandy, the Scheldt, the Netherlands. Men who moved through mud, villages, beaches, fields, and towns. Men who fought Germany while the Pacific War continued on the other side of the world. Men who helped make Allied victory possible before Japan's surrender finally closed the war. And it carried Hong Kong, Canada's direct wound in the war against Japan. The men of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Royal Rifles of Canada, the Canadians who fought in December 1941, the men who were killed, the men taken prisoner, the men who endured captivity, the families who waited in Canada with fear, grief, and unanswered questions. This is why the signature cannot be reduced to the wrong line. The wrong line is memorable. The wrong line is strange. The wrong line makes people lean closer to the story. But the signature itself is larger. It says Canada was present at the formal surrender of Japan. It says Canada had paid a price. It says Canada's service did not disappear because it was smaller than America's Pacific War, or less famous than MacArthur's stage. Canada was not the empire-shattering force in the Pacific. That must be said honestly. The United States carried the largest Allied military burden against Japan by 1945. China had suffered years of brutal war. Britain, Australia, the Netherlands, the Soviet Union, and other allies had their own roles and wounds. Canada's role was different, quieter, smaller in scale, but real. History often remembers scale before meaning. It remembers the largest fleet, the loudest general, the biggest bomb, the most famous photograph. But nations are not measured only by how loudly history speaks their name. Sometimes they are measured by whether they were there when the burden had to be carried. Canada was there in 1939. Canada was there in the Atlantic. Canada was there in the air training fields. Canada was there at Hong Kong. Canada was there in Europe. And Canada was there on the deck when Japan surrendered. For the Japanese delegation, the Canadian signature was one part of the Allied line. For Canadians, it was a reminder that their country had stood with the Allies until the end. Not only until victory in Europe, not only until Germany fell, until the final surrender of Japan, until the last formal page of the war was signed. Cosgrave's mistake made the story human. His presence made it historic. The error was a moment. The representation was the meaning. A Canadian stood on that deck because Canada had earned the right to be named among the nations that ended the war. The signature was small. The country behind it was not absent. The ceremony ended in minutes. The ship remained. The harbor remained. The cameras kept the images. The document carried the signatures. MacArthur stood at the center of memory. Japan's delegation stood at the center of defeat. The USS Missouri became one of the most famous stages in military history. But among the names on that page was Canada. Not the largest power, not the loudest voice. Not the country most people think of first when they imagine Japan's surrender, but there, present, recognized, written into the formal ending of the war. That is the heart of this story. The mistake was human. The presence was historic. The wrong line became famous, because history often remembers the small imperfection. But the bigger truth is quieter and stronger. Canada had a seat at the table. Canada had a signature on the page. Canada stood among the Allied nations when Japan accepted surrender. For the men of Hong Kong, for the prisoners who suffered, for the sailors who crossed the Atlantic, for the aircrew trained in Canadian skies, for the soldiers who fought across Europe, for the families who waited, for the country that carried the war from 1939 to 1945. That signature mattered. This is not a story about Canada commanding the surrender. It did not. It is not a story about Canada carrying the Pacific War alone. It did not. It is a story about presence, about recognition, about a country whose contribution was real enough that when the final surrender came, its name belonged on the document. Everyone remembers MacArthur. They should. Everyone remembers the USS Missouri. They should. Everyone remembers Japan signing surrender. They should. But Canada was there too. And that matters. The war ended in ink, and Canada's signature was there.